give it one moment to
Sure.
configure.
Yeah. If we can try to keep it to like 25 minutes today, I don't just
Yeah,
we'll see how it goes, but yeah. Our
let's
kids start
see.
school, so I'm trying to get there to see them, but
Yeah, I don't have those problems right now, which is good.
yeah,
Cool.
no, it's yeah. Cool.
Uh, and I think, let me just make sure we're live. Can't see anything yet, but here we go. Cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Download with Joe. I'm Lewis, founder of LMC. As always, here with Joe Amador, founder of Amador Consulting. This week, the theme is going to be focused all around financing. If you check my LinkedIn earlier, you'll see that some of the stuff we'll be speaking about today is new, some of it's old, but as always, it's good to get Joe, who's an expert in this particular domain, his insight into all of the topics that we discuss. Before we get going, Joe and I are going to be at Blueprint. So if anyone is going to Blueprint, as well as Nexus, Nexus Labs in Denver, then feel free to reach out if you want to set up time to connect whilst we're in
Yep.
Vegas or in Denver. So I think this is now the third round of financing or funding we're going to be talking about. I think what's nice is that the companies that we'll speak about are different to some of the other weeks that we've done VC fundraising on. We've got
Yep.
real estate decarb platforms, CMMS, which has been around for a long time. CMMS,
Yep.
renewables, ESG, data management. Before we get going, Joe, what's your sense on the market overall, just in terms of like the venture capital space and how that ties into
Yeah.
today's topic?
Yeah. So there definitely are half year or annual reports on just funding by category. And so you've generally seen, even in 2023 and certainly in 2024, just kind of a reduction top line in prop tech funding. And I think that probably won't surprise a lot of people. And then you've also seen a little bit of a decline on clean tech or climate tech. 2023 was a little down over 22. And then, but the reduction or the decline in funding on the climate tech side has not been nearly as great as prop tech. Now, climate tech includes a lot of things that are not real estate. So I just mentioned that as like high level numbers. I include a lot of those reports in the newsletter just because it's useful to know what's the macro state. We're also I'm probably going to have some guests in some of these subsequent episodes, and we can dig more into that. I think other data points I can give you, largely the companies raising money are raising very early rounds. So even in my newsletter, when I'm categorizing every month who's raising money, over 50% over the past, I would say, year or even longer than a year have been Series Seed, Series A. Sometimes they call it an A plus. There's not a lot of Bs, there's not a lot of Cs, there's not a lot of bigger rounds. Though there are some companies that have kind of had that escape velocity and are raising those big rounds. So, and a lot that we talk about here today are going to be, $5 million rounds, $8 million rounds, something, even less, Seed, I think one of them is just 1.5, or one or two of them are $1.5, $2 million rounds. So yeah, there's been more focus there. I don't think a lot of venture capitalists are writing as many checks as maybe they did a year and a half, 2 years ago. So they're also taking longer. So rounds typically are taking longer to come together. Part of that is because you're getting more no's. Part of that is because when you find a firm, a venture capital firm that wants to raise or invest in you, they're probably going to do more diligence. I do diligence with investors, not obviously every deal, but there's definitely deals there where I'm helping diligence them. And I can tell you there's a little bit more of a focus on almost, let's spend a half a day. Let's spend a day with you, Joe, to look at this and maybe get a quick yes or no. And that's even before an actual diligence project would take place. So that is adding to the timeline. That's maybe that is more diligence on the part of the venture firm. But I would also say, 2 years ago, I would sometimes talk to firms that would tell me, well, we didn't have a lot of time for the diligence, but now we want your help to actually kind of execute on what would have been the recommendations out of the diligence, right? My goal in diligence is not to say, here are all the bruises that you should know about, and here's all the negatives, and here's why you shouldn't invest. It's more, here's what's good, here's what's not so good, here's where you can probably invest some of your time and effort to fix, and that kind of gives them an actionable plan, right? We're investing, what do we do next? There were cases where firms said, hey, we've already invested, but we want that action plan, and I could help. Now it's what would our action plan be should we invest? And sometimes the result there is, oh yeah, we're not going to invest.
It's interesting because, before we touch on a couple of the first ones, you look at some of the data analytics platforms that focus on
Yeah,
where VC or PE money is going, and we're
yeah,
talking
yeah,
billions and billions of dollars a quarter or over
yeah,
the course of a year,
yeah,
and you just think, I never really see big deals. I never really, I can't really put my finger on
yeah.
where this money's going.
Well, so that's a good point, and I don't have the numbers at hand. I know maybe I'll find a report. When you look at climate tech, there's a bunch of categories that are included, and sometimes renewables are pulled out from built environment. You could say that's all infrastructure, but there's a breakdown. Agriculture, which can include things like um, alternatives to dairy. It can actually include farming techniques. Built environment, which is really the closest thing a lot of those reports would have to real estate and physical energy management systems or software energy management systems, that's typically one of the smallest categories. So when you think of climate tech billions, prop tech, that's sometimes I've seen some reports and some studies on prop tech, and they're including things like Zillow, Redfin, and yes, that is technically prop tech. That's just very different than what we're talking about, right? It's residential, it's
True.
consumer oriented. Just those are two kind of things that we don't really touch in our space.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of the reason. I think there's a lot of money flowing to things outside of our core smart buildings or solutions to decarb real estate.
Okay, interesting. So I remember when we caught up on this series a few weeks ago. We were talking about different companies, application plays, turnkey, end-to-end
Yeah.
solutions.
Yep.
The first company that we're going to talk about just raised a seed round by you, focused on utility bill management, which clearly is still a
Yeah.
huge problem to solve in the space. Talk us through that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So bioenergy, and I think my speculation, I think the team that started it went to LSU, Louisiana State, and that's the Bayou, right? So I think that's where the name comes from. I don't know if they're still there, but this is still an issue, right? So you think about in the US alone, you have over like 3,150 utilities. Now, a lot of those are co ops. So if you go into a rural area, rural Colorado, rural, anything else, you're going to have a local. So when you think 3,150 or so providers of a utility bill, an average corporation is not touching 3,000. But it's very likely when you look at the IOUs, the investor-owned utilities, you might have, I think there's 200, 250 of them. And so every major city you go to probably has an IOU. There are some major cities that have a muni. Those are the three main categories of utilities. You have investor-owned utilities. That would be like Con Ed, ComEd, Duke Energy, Southern Company, which has operating entities. So those are investor-owned. You can buy stock in them. You have munis owned by the city. LA DWP is a good example. Seattle City Light is a good example. Austin Energy is a good example. There's a few others, but there are some big cities where your utility is owned by or overseen by the city. And then you have the co-ops. So between the munis and the investor-owned utilities, which is probably what any corporation is going to touch or commercial real estate firm, because New York, LA, the places they're operating, you're still talking about hundreds. The process, I mean, you think back to 10 years ago under the Obama administration, there was this idea of a green button, right? Like a simple way to programmatically get utility bill data, right? Same format. That never really took off. There are definitely some utilities that implement green button. They say they're green button compliant. When you look at the actual API, it's always a little bit different. So it's more of like guardrails or like, a fence to keep you on the fence, but like you still can decide which lane do you want to be in on a highway. so what these companies do, like Bayou, is they say we actually are going to provide kind of a private sector version of Green Button. They don't use the term Green Button in many cases. The kind of first mover here was Urginet, and Urginet's now part of Acadia, but there's still opportunities because you have, again, hundreds of utilities. They all have their own process, and there's different ways to acquire those data. It can be people that are receiving the bills. It can be people who are logging in, downloading the PDF. You can do OCR. You can actually digitally collect data via an API. Maybe it's not an API. Maybe it's another programmatic interface. So there, Bayou, from what I've seen, is trying to innovate on the side of we're not, there are no people touching your utility bills, right? It's all programmatic. And that kind of reminds me a little bit of WegoWise, which is now owned by Measurable, where they also took this approach of we want to build software to do it. The challenge there can be you have to build an interface or an integration with every single utility, which is different, and you have to maintain it. And as you get to dozens, to 50, to 100, it just becomes more and more difficult because there's maintenance of the existing APIs or integrations. There's building new integrations, but that's what Bayou's doing. My sense, and they haven't said this publicly, is that they're probably focused on certain utilities in certain geographies and trying to build a little bit of a beachhead and then growing from there. That's typically the way these firms operate.
Interesting. Do we know what the seed round looked like in terms of numbers?
I think it was 1.5 million. It was a small round. I don't recall any well-known investors, but there were a few. I mean, there were. Yeah, so it was very small. I've seen them there. Yeah, they seem to have an interesting offering. The other thing I was going to say more broadly, without talking about specific vendors, when I talk to owners of real estate assets, they still say the data acquisition problem hasn't been solved. Now, that's kind of a general framing. When you ask what's the problem, it can just be this utility, the data is never clean. And that could be the utility's fault. That could be the vendor's fault. It's hard to figure out whose fault is it. But there's absolutely some room to try to make this, improve data integrity, I think, is the big problem you hear from people who need these data. The other one is, you kind of touched on this at the very beginning, Lewis, this is kind of a middleware product, right? Like they solve the data acquisition piece, but they don't build the application layer. So they become a natural partner for a lot of companies that make the application layer.
Okay, interesting. Good luck to them. The next one, which I can't remember whether we saw each other at Cretech last year, but I remember seeing this company at Cretech and thinking they were a pretty interesting business, and they've just raised another seed round, Acacia, which I think you were mentioning previously. They're typically out of APAC, but are looking to expand in some capacity.
Yeah, they raised it. It was a couple million. It was a very small round again. They raised, their lead investor here was Excel, big, well-known Silicon Valley, Sand Hill Road, or near Sand Hill Road, VC, which has different vehicles, has done a little bit of investing. One of their vehicles, Excel, which is a Excel KKR, they invested in Visi, which was bought by IBM, and they invested, I don't know, 5-8 years ago. So they're not a prop tech or clean tech or climate tech investor, but they've definitely had some exposure here. Yeah, Acacia is operating right now in Asia. I didn't see any indication, at least on, sometimes when you announce a fundraise, you say this money will go towards expanding into America or this or that. And so they may just continue to grow in Asia. Now, they say we are a real estate decarbonization platform. Now, the challenge is that means a lot of different things. I wrote up a little article on what I called enterprise decarb analytics solutions, kind of a broad category. They would fit in there, but this includes a lot of different, both data pieces. You could say we're a middleware provider just to enable real estate decarbonization. And there's the modeling side, there's the reporting side, and different companies have a different surface area. I'm somewhat skeptical broadly in that category on just how much surface area do you really cover, because it's so vast. And raising $1, $2, $3 million, having a team of 5 to 10 people, it just doesn't seem like you can naturally cover as much ground as you want to cover given that size of the team. There's also the side of if you're already using a product to do the reporting every year, you then naturally want to say, well, how do we actually improve our real estate? That's a question I've seen asked more and more and more. Some of the answers are, well, I don't have time to do that. I'm spending all my time reporting. That's a problem, of course, but it's not necessarily the problem you can solve alone. So if you're already using those companies are going to say, well, we want to do more to help you kind of get on a glide path towards net zero. Or maybe it's not net zero, maybe it's just massive reduction in carbon. So this is where I think there's both companies with different surface areas. There's some companies already working with a lot of vendors to do one of the use cases. But I've seen just so many companies. I mean, another one we're talking about later is just an ESG data platform, Osapiens. There's just a lot of money flowing into that specific category of software to manage enterprise-wide or portfolio scale reporting and reduction in carbon. It's not only carbon, right? It can be water reductions, waste reductions, but carbon and energy are the big one where there's usually the most priority.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's some interesting businesses that we're working with that fit in that remit. Before we jump onto the next one, do you think
Sure, yeah.
do you think smart building software platforms will eventually cover some of the decarbonization tools like reporting and
Yeah, you almost have you have two teams. It could be more than two teams, right? But you have the facilities team and they want smart building technology, right? They're looking at each building with different base building systems and saying, look, it's just it's kind of a mess. And I have the individual in my team that knows how to use this system, the access control system. I have another individual that knows how to use the building automation system. Another individual knows how to use, so it's like it becomes challenging to run buildings. And then you think, well, across my portfolio, every building has different base building systems. So smart building solutions have a big role to play there. Additionally, those systems on the base building systems often don't give you any type of analytics, any type of actionable intelligence, as much as just there's a problem, we can flag the problem. You should know how to fix the problem, right? Like people are uncomfortable on this floor. So there's a lot going on there. On the decarb side, you have oftentimes it's led by sustainability, energy, could be the same team, could be different teams working together. It could be ESG if it's more broad than sustainability. And those teams typically are more portfolio focused anyway. So I do see convergence there. This is a long-winded way of saying, I don't know if it's the smart building solutions subsuming sustainability or sustainability subsuming smart buildings or different solutions that just naturally start working together. It does seem to me that at the board level or the management level of a real estate company, decarbonization is a bigger strategic challenge than digitizing the building. If you had to put it into two buckets, we digitize the building or we decarbonize the building. Of course, you and I both know, Lewis, there's a lot that does both. I think they're going to say the strategic goal or imperative, if you will, is decarbonization. I don't know that they're saying the same thing about digitization. That could change though, right? Like you could find in 3-4 years, we need to digitize our real estate assets because we actually see progress in terms of more leasing activity, more occupancy, but we want our buildings to be the best. We want them to be the number one building per city or among the number one. How do we do that? Well, we want to make them green. We want to decarbonize them. But right now we can make them the most tech forward experience. Whereas to take a big building, I don't think overnight you're going to be able to decarbonize that building to actually get it to net zero, right? It's a multi-year process. So I could see it playing both ways. It's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's probably more pressure from C-suite to start or to continue their net zero progress as opposed to digitalizing buildings. Again, I think there's convergence for both, but as you know more than I, it's very hard to get. It's very hard for these individuals to do one thing, let alone both at the same time. A lot of red tape.
The one thing I will add, when I look at individual companies, right? Like I do competitive analyses all the time for companies. I help with procurement sometimes. There is a little bit of a differentiation, or maybe there's separation between companies that really want to be a smart building solution and companies that want to be a decarbonizing building solution. There's definitely some companies that overlap, But generally, you can put them, the companies that is, into one or two of those one of those two buckets, and say they're more this than that. So I haven't seen as much convergence on the side of the vendors yet.
Got it. Okay, so 3 to go. If we're going to hit our 25, 30-minute timeline, we're
Yeah,
going to
we'll
have to
try
do
to go
2 minutes each
quickly.
one.
It's fun to talk
So,
about this stuff. Yeah.
no, 100%. Selfishly, for me anyway.
Yeah.
So, Cove, CMMS workplace platform,
Yep.
they've just raised, I think it's a Series A. Correct me if I'm wrong there, or
Yeah, I was Series A, a couple million. Again, Nuveen led, and that team is strong. I know that the Nuveen team very well. A lot of you listening probably do as well. But yes, yeah. Keep going. I didn't mean to cut you off. Yeah.
No, I was just keen to get your thoughts there, because when you think about
Yeah.
CMMS, it feels like table stakes at this stage. But I
Yeah.
guess when you combine
Yeah.
CMMS and then obviously the workplace push, that could be
Yeah.
the edge.
Yeah, Cove's a little unique in that, so they've been around for a number of years. So they've kind of been growing slowly. It's funny, you see some companies that within a year or two, they're raising very massive rounds, generally in our space. You see other companies that grow kind of slowly, and then they hit a bit of acceleration, and then they start raising big rounds, or they just don't raise a lot of money. They're just able to grow naturally. But Cove, I mean, I've seen them at events at least 2-3 years, maybe even longer than that. So they've been around. What they combine, they're not the only ones, but I think, I've heard generally positive feedback. The workplace experience side, so I'm a occupant in this building, and there are things I need: find a desk, reserve a desk, book a conference room. There's a whole host of other things. Have an app. There are companies that even will say, we'll help you like turn lights on, turn lights off. That's maybe it requires more integration. So that's workplace, right? And I know individuals in the industry who talk about that as being the front of the house, right? Like that is what you think of real estate becoming very more of a hospitality oriented focus. You come in, like, you don't go into the kitchen, but you are getting food. You're sitting down, or at the hotel, you don't go into the kitchen. You're going to your room. So there's the front of the house, and there's the back of the house, which is all the stuff that has to get done. Work orders is the big unit of work, or unit of data, as well. So Cove does both. Historically, you if you went 5-8 years ago, you didn't have a lot of workplace experience platforms. That's something that has emerged over before the pandemic, but a couple of years before the pandemic. And then you look at CMMS software, and there's a whole host of on-prem CMMS platforms. There's definitely been some M&A there. You look at Eptura, EPTURA. They're kind of a combination of, I think, 4 or 5 or maybe even more different CMMS platforms. Archibus is the older one, and I say older one because they've been around, I think, since the 80s. It's a lot of on-prem Archibus, but there's Space IQ mixed in there. There's iOffice mixed in there. So there's been over, let's say, 8 to 10 years, companies on the CMMS front saying this shouldn't be on-prem. There's a lot of work to upgrade, right? Just like every other tech industry, it's all moving to the cloud. So that has driven some upgrades, some conquest sales. And then you have, JLL has participated here. They own Corrigo. They bought Building Engines. They all have their own software solutions. But I think where Cove would fit is they would say, look, one, we're a little more of a tech forward experience. We combine a few different things that you might have different platforms to do. And, oftentimes with these younger companies, they're a little bit more flexible, right? The product hasn't been around for 20 years. It's not like as baked in. And I also think some of these firms that are combining a lot of different base systems, we bought this CMS, that CMS, this other CMS. We have 5 CMSs, 4 CMSs, even 2 or 3. Rationalizing that is a challenge, right? So you may be putting a lot of engineering effort into rationalizing all these platforms versus building a lot of new features. And that's, I think, where Cove also could have a little bit of an advantage. But I think if I was to sit down, I could probably come up with dozens of CMMS. A lot of times the CMS solutions are very industry specific. So you go to healthcare, hospitality, schools and municipal governments and universities, public sector institutions. Exactly. There's a whole ecosystem of CMMS vendors in each of them. I don't think there's any sign that Cove wants to, go across all of those industries, at least not initially. And I don't think this funding would be enough for them to do that. But there's definitely room for new entrants there.
Interesting. We'll keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
Paces. This is the first renewables company that we'll be speaking on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Backed by some big companies, actually.
Yeah, exactly. They, yeah, I mean, Navitas, which has been investing in real estate technology or decarbonization real estate tech for 15 plus years. I mean, when I worked at JCI in like 2011, 2012, I met the team. So they've been around, they've raised multiple funds. They're kind of one of the more original investors in this space before it was cool. Suffolk Construction, Y Combinator also participated. Um, we don't cover renewables is interesting, right? Because there's a huge renewables component within the built environment, but there's a lot of renewables companies I come across just seeing announcements where I think it's not exactly real estate tech, right? You could have renewables that are just you're building kind of a utility scale a renewable site that's just putting power on the grid, and then that's obviously important. That there's a lot of technology that goes into that, but it doesn't really touch the building owners, right? They're still just buying their power. But what this company does is they do GIS to site renewables, and there's a bunch of companies I've come across that take different approaches. And I think if you look at the life cycle of I want to invest in renewables, well, if you have a portfolio, think warehouse is a really good example because there's a lot of roof space, and not all of it, but some of it you may be able to put solar on. If you have 500, 1,000 sites in different states, even just figuring out like where are the 30 that I should focus on, both find vendors, get proposals, model out energy consumption, energy savings. You probably don't do that with 500. So being able to say like where are the 30 that seem most, and it's probably not as simple as look at Texas, look at Florida, look at California, look at Arizona. There's a lot of sunlight, right? It's probably a little more complicated of an analysis than that. And so there's tools you're seeing that say we just help you on the front end of where can you put solar. We can model it out. There are some companies I've come across for renewables that actually manage the procurement process. We know all of the actual installers in this area. We know those that have done 50 jobs. We know those who have done one job, and we know those who haven't done any jobs, but they want to do jobs. And we can manage the procurement cycle, and we actually can kind of put your RFP into a software solution. And there's that, and then of course there's the actual. We want to deploy. We want to manage this as an asset, the cash flow, the savings, and then just all the physical maintenance that's required. So you're actually seeing companies pop up across. Paces is really on that front end, right? Where can we site solar? What do the numbers look like? What's most promising? And honestly, they're not the first, and I don't think they'll be the last company that really wants to focus on that front end. And some companies I've seen, they really say we help you with the feasibility study, which is just the sustainability team can run that and go to finance and say we'd like to finance this, or we'd like to actually use some of the money in the budget to deploy this project. And they might then go to different vendors to actually help them execute. So it's kind of a vast space. I think when you map out, I'm an owner of real estate, what's my process? You're finding firms pop up that help, software firms or technology firms that pop up along the whole life cycle.
Yeah, it's not business I'm familiar with, but I like the sound of them. And then finally, we touched on it briefly earlier, but
Yeah,
Osapiens focused on ESG data management.
yeah.
Again,
Yeah.
go on.
Oh no, I was just gonna say this was a big round, right? This was like tens of millions. I think it was approaching 100 million offhand. But not exclusively real estate. It's just the ESG data management story is probably the most consistent, well-funded story or theme, if you will, across our industry. I would say over the past, let's say, year. And in some cases, that's not real estate specific, right? It's just we help institutions, industry, companies, whatever it is, manage all of their data, review it, audit it. There's that process, make sure it's complete, and then actually report out. Now, the skeptic in me says, what is really different about any of these companies? Because when I dig in, I think, one, there's existing vendors that do a lot of this, but maybe have a broader story to tell. There's some very specific things like scope 3 emissions that are important and challenging and difficult, but you could argue it's going to be hard to automate that in software, right? It's always going to be a bit of a data-driven, software-driven consulting process versus just automated in software. And that's like I was drinking coffee, right? What's the embedded carbon of the coffee? And that includes the both the actual growing of the coffee beans, transport of the coffee beans to wherever they're going, the roasting of the coffee beans, which uses energy, packaging it up, shipping it to the store. Like it's broader than that, but that's giving you a sense of the scope 3. That's not as important for real estate, just because once the building is built, there are some scope 3 emissions. There's more on the construction side. But that's an area where I don't know that you're going to be able to, in the near term, get to put in data, it models it out, it gives you the number. I mean, historically, there have been consulting firms that help with that. But that's one theme. But more broadly, there's just a lot of money flowing into ESG data management. There's a lot of companies. I think if we were to put together a list, you could argue there's probably a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen even new entrants over the past 3 years that just say we're an ESG data management platform. But they're raising very large amounts of money is the other angle.
No, I agree. And again, if we talk about specifically smart buildings, you don't necessarily see a $100 million euro round, if ever. I think there's only been 2 that I remember on record.
Exactly. I can't even think of a good one, but they're typically 20, 25, 30 million. There's definitely a few out there, I think, but I don't think there's been a lot of returns to justify yet, let's say, but returns to justify those rents.
Keyword being yet. Well played.
Yes. Yeah, we'll see. Yeah. I'm bullish on the space, but as you can see, like I'm a skeptic in certain angles, certain places.
Yeah, no, you have to be. About that.
Yeah.
Well, Joe, really appreciate your time once again. Hope everyone enjoyed this, and if you've got any comments, questions, or queries on anything that we've discussed or something you'd like to see discussed over the next few weeks, then please reach out to Joe and myself.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of really interesting guests lined up, so we hope that over the next 4 to 6 weeks you can continue to tune in. And again, if there's anything that we're missing or anything that you would love to see, please get in touch. Final comment or final two, if you'd like to be a guest on the Download with Joe and have an interesting topic or angle on where the industry's going across smart buildings, climate tech, energy transition, then again, reach out to us and let's see if we can collaborate. And then finally, Joe, newsletter's out and it's another good one. So where can people go and find that?
So easiest way, you can find me on LinkedIn, and I share from the newsletter often. The newsletter is on Substack, so it's just Smart Building Insight, all one word, .substack.com. I'll include that link in the comments here. So a lot of different ways. AmadorConsulting.com is the other place that you can get to the newsletter. That's our website. And only other thing to mention, you've now started putting these on YouTube, so it's a little easier to find them. So people can go there as well if they don't like LinkedIn.
Well remembered. Yep. So there's different ways to watch or listen to these. So we'll see you next week. A different topic, but thanks for tuning in, and see you soon.
Thanks all. See you, Lewis. Have a good day.